Now, in order to move forward in this Ramban, we have to open up the Chumash Shmos. If you can get yourself a Chumash, Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Chav. And although the Ramban doesn't mention this pasuk explicitly, but he does intimate that there's something very important going on in this pasuk. And you know what? I think I'm going to get myself a Torah Tmima, which I think we have here, because that'll give it to us even better. So we're in Perek Yud Ches. Pasuk Chav. Vizharta esem es hachukim ves hatoros vodato lahem es haderech yelchu va ves hamase asher yasun. So I'm going to present this in a reverse order. What do I mean? First, I'm going to mention 3 Gemaras. And then I'm going to ask you, in what context does this pasuk appear? So the first Gemara is in Masechta Bava Kama, Daf Tzadik Tes, quoted here in the Torah Tmima. And the Gemara in Bava Kama goes through each part of this very lengthy pasuk, chops it up into its various component parts, and derives obligations from each particular segment of the pasuk. For example, it says, Es haderech. What is derech? Zu gemilas chasadim. Yelchu, zu biker chol. Ba zu kvura, ves hamaisa zedin, asher yasun zelifnim mishur sadin. That's one Gemara. Another Gemara is in Moikot Daf Hey. Es haderech ashel yelchu ba, remez litzion kvaros min Torah, etc. And then finally, Gemara in Kiddushin, Es haderech yelchu ba, mikan de derech loshen nekeva. So now let me ask you a question. We spoke about Kamilas Chasadim, we spoke about Bikur Cholim, we spoke about Kfuras Hames, and all this is intimated by the various segments of this pasuk. Now my question to you is, in what context do we find this pasuk? Who is actually speaking here in this pasuk? Anybody?
Where's the pasuk again?
Oh, okay. Yud Ches in Shmos, pasuk Chav. Anybody? Who's the speaker?
Well,
Hashem.
isn't Hashem instructing Moshe?
Who's speaking?
Isn't
In Yiddish,
God,
we say the Shver. Okay, who's speaking?
Why is Hashem telling Moshe?
This is not Hashem. I'm asking who's speaking. It's not Hashem who's speaking. It's not Moshe who's speaking. Who's speaking? I'll give you a hint. It's the name of the parsha.
Yitro?
Oh, you got it. Yitro. For example, if you take a look, you'll see in Pasuk Yudalid, Vayar Chosein Moshe es kol asheru oseh. Okay, so this is Chosein Moshe, that's none other than Yisro. Or for example, if you take a look at Pasuk Yud Zayin, it says Vayomer Chosein Moshe Elav, Lo Tov Hadover Asher Ta Oseh. Novel Tibol in Pasuk Yud Ches. And then we go on to pasuk Yutes ato shma b'koli iyatzcha v'hi Elokim imach. I'm going to give you a recommendation. May God be with you. And the speaker continues to be Yisrael. And then in pasuk Chaf, which is our pasuk, again it's Yisrael. Now, why do I point this out? Because the BaHaG, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, counts each one of these as a separate mitzvah in the Taryag. So he's got, for example, Bikur Cholam as a separate mitzvah. He's got the mitzvah of Kvura as a separate mitzvah. And all the dimensions of Gemilas Chasadim. So if you take a look, getting back to the Ramban, which we were holding on page Mem Dalid, so the Ramban quotes the BaHaG, which the Rambam before him had quoted this BaHaG, and the BaHaG has every dimension of this pasuk counted as a separate mitzvah. So, for example, in the counting of Taryag, he's got Bikur Cholam, he's got Malbish Harumin, he has the mitzvah of Kvuras Hames. Each one is a separate mitzvah. He's got Nicham Avelim as a separate mitzvah. And Nicham Avelim is also derived from this pasuk. So the last thing that we discussed, which was, I think, about maybe a week or two ago, I don't remember, is that all of these are integrated into one whole. They're not meant to be separated and counted. Each one is an independent mitzvah, but it's all part of the great mitzvah of imitating God, which is called Lizdamos Bo, to be similar to God. And that's what it means to go in the way of God. So we imitate God. He was Malbish Harum in the case of Adam V'Chava. We imitate God, who was Mevakar Cholim in the case of Yitzchak Avinu after the death of Avram. And we find that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Menachem Avelim in the case of Yitzchak. We find that God buried the dead in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu. So we are imitating God. There's no reason, and at this point the Ramban says, I really cannot defend the BaHaG, no reason to justify counting each one of these various aspects of imitating God as a separate mitzvah. It's all part and parcel of one entity. For example, in Shabbos, we're not going to count 39 malachas. Each one is a separate lotase because they all form one entity, one unit. And we're going to see this over and over again, that when it comes to counting mitzvos, we're not going to count separate mitzvos based on, different individual scenarios, if all those scenarios really belong to one greater whole and one entity. Slicha? Oh, ani b'emtza shiur po. Okay, then. So this is what we find over here in the Ramban. But now, let me just shut this off here. Now the Ramban goes a little bit further, and he says the following. Lefi daiti od, in my opinion, says Ramban, I can go even further in this line of reasoning. So again, if you happen to be following the text inside, which this is meant to be a text-oriented shir, we're on page Mem Dalid in the Sefer Mitzvos of the Rambam. We're on the left column, 5 lines up before the end of that column. Ki ein roy limnos shum mitzvah mishum asharas Yisrael leMoshe Rabbeinu. Interesting argument. He says that you can only count mitzvos if they come from the Holy One or from Moshe Rabbeinu's holy mouth. And as great as Yisro was, Yisro is never going to be the source of a mitzvah in Taryag. So until this point, the Ramban was arguing against the BaHaG. How can you count these individual situations and obligations as separate mitzvos when they really belong to one greater whole? What we call Gemilas Chasadim. But now the Ramban is taking a different line of reasoning. And he's arguing that if you have a mitzvah in the Torah that comes from the mouth of someone other than Moshe Rabbeinu, or from the mouth of the one above, that cannot be counted as part of Taryag. Be'ilu lodia. Now, I don't know what the word be'ilu is. Believe me, I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. Be'ilu lodia osam liYisrael. V'lidrosh lehem sheyu zerizim be'ilu hamitzvahs tamid. He says that the goal of Yisro is not to create new mitzvahs. That's not what Yisro is authorized to do. He's not interested in usurping the role of his great son-in-law Moshe Rabbeinu, but rather his purpose is to notify the people of Israel and darshan in front of them, meaning give them a real arousing speech. That they should be very careful about the other mitzvahs. Yisro is not trying to give new mitzvahs, but rather he's trying to encourage and sustain our energy force to fulfill the mitzvahs that are already given. So he's going to tell us to be very careful about these mitzvahs. And not only that, Yisro has a goal in mind. And he thinks that there's something specific about these particular mitzvahs that demand our meticulous care and meticulous observance. Why? What is the, shall we say, the school of power? I know that's a word that's hard to define in English. There's some sort of metaphysical power of certain mitzvahs. And what is the power inherent in the mitzvah? I'll be right with you, Bruce. In order to create a camp, what do I mean by camp? I mean a society, a group in which there is peace and harmony, brotherhood and friendship, we need to be careful about these things like Nicham Avelim and Malbish Harumim and Bikur Cholim. All of these are meant to cement the Jewish community together. Now, what does Yisro think is going to be achieved by cementing the Jewish community together? Think about it. Again, in what area of Jewish law was Yisro, pardon the term, critiquing Moshe Rabbeinu and trying to improve and upgrade that area of Jewish law? What's the answer?
Well, I guess it's a comment that it seems amazing that a judiciary or legislative bodies, whomever's going to adjudicate or deal with problems, is not clearly spelled out in the Torah, and that Yitro needs to give this as advice on how to set this up. Only because Moshe Rabbeinu is going to have a limited lifespan.
What did Yisro become aware of that led him to the conclusion that the system needs rectification, improvement?
He thought somehow there's a lack of derech eretz and people standing around Moshe all day. It's going to tire Moshe out.
Maybe that's a lack of derech eretz, but there's something more fundamental.
Moshe was overwhelmed.
Excellent. That's the word I need.
But what would he think would happen?
I owe you one, Avi.
What would we think would happen?
That's the key word.
Rabbi, what do we think would happen after Moshe's lifetime? I mean, this is very specific that Moshe needs to deal with, but how can the Torah be absent on the process post-Moshe?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Bruce. Maybe you're a few steps ahead of me and I'm behind you.
The advice is specific to Moshe because he's overwhelmed. But doesn't the Torah give us any advice what to do in dealing with cases that need to come to a Beit Din and need to be adjudicated?
Well, again, we're not talking about cases. We're talking about the structure of the Batei Dinim.
Right, so
what happened was the people wanted to go directly to the leader. They wanted to get the word from the prophet. You know, let's say, for example, if you and I would have, chas v'shalom, some sort of altercation or some sort of litigation it would be great if we could go to the Supreme Court, if you follow what I mean.
Yeah, but millions of people can't do that, obviously,
Oh,
in any real
so
time.
comes along Yisro, and that's exactly his point. His point is that Moshe Rabbeinu, you can't do a one-man job. You've got to create a system of judges. You got to appoint judges. You got to have lower courts. You have to have upper courts. But
how can the Torah be absent on that? Why do we
Again,
need this person to say it? It's like,
again, Bruce, you're a few steps ahead of me. I'm not ready to ask you the question of why the Torah. Right now, I'm just trying to understand why is it that Yisro is going to impress Moshe Rabbeinu to, on the other hand, to impress the people of Israel, to inspire them in areas like Gemilas Chasadim, Nicham Avelim, Halbashas Arumim, Kvuras Hames. Why is this uppermost on Yisro's mind?
How do we know that's on his mind based on the advice he gives? Aren't you expanding?
Without the Ramban, I don't know what's on Yisro's mind. I only know it from this Ramban.
How does the Ramban know what's on his mind?
The Ramban is trying to integrate two parts of Yisro's presentation. There was part A and part B. And the Ramban wants to stitch it all together, bind it all together into one entity, into one enterprise. There's one agenda, and that's Yisro's agenda, to somehow reduce the burden that's overwhelming Moshe and create a more, shall I say, lucrative system of judgment. And here the Ramban says that Yisro came forward with two different approaches, both to achieve the same goal. The agenda is one, but two answers. It's like when Tosa says, Inami, I can give you another way. The goal is the same. If you take a look in football and soccer, there's the goal line. The question is how to get to the goal line. And Yisro says, I have two different projects or policies, both of which will guarantee that we reach the goal line. And the goal line is some sort of system that is operative, that is meaningful, that is lucrative. What are the two approaches of Yisro? One approach is Moshe Rabbeinu, don't do it all on your own. This is not a one-man show. Create a system, find people who fit a whole list of descriptions and adjectives, single them out amongst the Jewish people, and appoint them as your judges. But now Yisro comes up with another answer to the problem. And he says, you know what? Let's go back to, I hate to use this term because, there's one thing that gets me nervous is going to a dentist, but let's get down to root canal work. What is the root canal work is? Why are we overwhelmed by litigation? Why are we finding what we call in modern Hebrew sifsuchim, constant friction and issues? And the answer, says Yisro, is our problem is love. Love, which the Ramban reduces to four different points. Number one, he calls it Ava. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Number two, he calls it Achva, which is brotherhood. Number three, he calls it Reus, which is friendship. And finally, number four, he calls it Shalom, which is peace. So it's almost as if the policy of Yisro that he's suggesting to Moshe Rabbeinu is, you know what? If you're overwhelmed by litigation, what's the root cause? And this, honestly, maybe you saw it in the parsha. I did not see it in the parsha. I only know it from the mouth of the Ramban.
I'm curious where he sees that. Where does the Ramban see that in the words of the parsha?
Because again, who is Yisro to say to Moshe Rabbeinu, "Vodatem lahem es haderech yelchu ba"? Well, what does that have to do with Yisro?
Well, he's a father-in-law, and he's a former high priest himself who might have had to take care of litigation back in Midian. So he's giving advice.
What does that have to do with Albashas Arumim and Nicham Avelim? I mean, those are very nice mitzvahs, but why is Yisro coming up? Yisro is not the personality of mitzvahs. Yisro's not going to tell you, hey, tell the people be careful to wear tzitzis on their begadim. to wear tefillin every morning, to recite Kriyat Shema. That's not Yisro's business. What, Yisro became the lawgiver of Israel? And all of a sudden, Yisro says, be very careful with A, B, C, and D. It's totally out of place.
Again, if the
It's
Ramban
not
didn't say
appropriate
that,
for Yisro. It doesn't fit with his personality and his authority. For that, we have a Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the lawgiver. And secondly, what does it have to do with Yisro's critique of Moshe Rabbeinu?
if the Ramban didn't tell us that, would you see this anywhere in the
No,
writing?
nowhere. It's only
don't-
from this Ramban.
And he doesn't tell us where he sees it from. The Ramban doesn't mention where he gets the idea from.
Yeah, no, that's why I'm trying to explain where the Ramban got it from. But you don't have to accept what I say. I have the right to say what I say. You have the right to reject what I say. And that's what Torah learning is all about. But I'm going to present the thesis that the Ramban is going to prove to us in his structure that Yisro is not giving us new mitzvos. Yisro is only encouraging a change in society. It's like, I don't know, what was his name in South Africa? Having a senior moment now, but let's say, Martin Luther King, or, you have various people in South Africa. There was a great leader. Come on, guys, help me out here. Okay. We don't have it.
In where? What country?
In South Africa.
Mandela.
Mandela. Thank you. Oh, you big time, Bruce. Mandela. So you have people throughout history who step forward to improve society, to see how we can set up a society which will lead to mutual respect, which will lead to brotherhood, to create bonds between people so that we work together rather than against each other towards common goals. And ultimately, it's peace. We want to create peace. And that's what brotherhood is all about.
I thought we learned those things from Rabbi Akiva, who said to love your fellow as yourself. And these are things that are derivatives of that. Nothing to do with
Yisro, and he asks the following question. What does the Torah mean when it says love your fellow Jew? And I could offer you a long list of possible answers. Should I be writing a birthday card to you, an anniversary card? Should I be kissing and hugging you? Should we dance together and sing together? I mean, there are many, many different answers to this question.
But it could be
and Yisro came up with his own unique answer to the question of how to achieve love in society. So the Ramban is asking, well, why does Yisro feel that that's at that particular juncture in history, he feels the responsibility to answer the question and come forward with a legislation that will cement the people together and create peace. So there are two questions we're asking here. Question number one is, what was Yisro's focus? Meaning, how did he come to his particular unique legislation in order to achieve peace? And question number two is, why did Yisro see that at that juncture in history as his responsibility, as if the world stands on his shoulders? And the Ramban answers both questions with one answer, and that is that Yisro saw a nation in front of him that was full of litigation, where the courts there weren't any courts, but even if there were courts, they were constantly overwhelmed. Again, if you want to be a muckraker and talk about Israeli society today, you may say the same thing.
No, but I would say
we don't have enough doctors, maybe we don't have enough judges, and we don't have enough lawyers, and there's litigation going on all the time. My wife, for example, works in interior design, and she puts him, and whenever somebody's doing a renovation, you can bet your bottom dollar that the neighbor next door to the right, the neighbor next door to the left, the neighbor upstairs, the neighbor downstairs, they're all suing the guy for doing a renovation. And so the courts are overwhelmed. How can we work together to create a society where we don't have this overabundance of litigation? And here's where Yisro decided, self-appointed legislator, to come forward with all these legislations. But the Ramban points out that that would not justify counting each one of these legislations in the Taryag, because the Ramban introduces a principle, a precondition to counting something as a mitzvah. And what's the answer to that? The mitzvah has to come from whose mouth? Either the one above or Moshe Rabbeinu. It cannot come from Yisro. So again, just to summarize, we have two different reasons why the Ramban objects to the BaHaG. Number one, because all of these different dimensions and legislations, all of these various obligations are merely subcategories of a greater whole. And that greater whole is counted in Taryag. Namely, we have to imitate the Almighty. And answer number two is we cannot count these legislations and obligations in the Taryag because they come from Yisro and not from Moshe.
I want to say that if you would have 1,000 cases standing on line in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, he'd be overwhelmed. And yet 1,000 people with legitimate claims, not spurious claims, out of millions of people standing around is a very, very small percentage, very small. And so it's not as if the people were litigious at all. It's just that he was the only one judging. And so,
yeah, but could you imagine in a utopian society? I'm just walking over to get myself a drink because I got very thirsty. Could you imagine in a perfect society when there was pure brotherhood and peace? Again, you might sue your brother in a court of law. I wouldn't want to do that. No offense. I don't mean you, Bruce. I'm saying, in an absolute society of brotherhood, I don't sue my brother in a court of law. I work it out with him.
I know, but I think
come up with a compromise.
I think you're making a straw man case, because in the rest of the world, if you don't have courts, when you have an argument, you kill each other. So the Jews are on a nice high level where instead of killing each other or having vendettas that last for generations, they take not a spurious case, a serious case. They go to court on a which is very nice. That's a very high level.
Yeah, it gives the judges a salary. That's important.
That's how you resolve a machloket, is you go to court, and for a very serious case.
But the answer to your question, Bruce, is in the words that came out of your mouth. They go to court because of machlokes.
No, but they love each other.
Why do we have to have machlokes? Imagine a society without machlokes. Yisro was a dreamer. He was a thinker.
I don't know why two cars bump each other and they have an argument of what took place. They love each other. There's a great brotherhood here. Every now and then things occur despite whether you want an outside.
Bruce, what percentage of people that go to court are lovers and brothers? Come on, let's be honest about it. When two people go to court for a litigation, they're not lovers and brothers. If they were lovers and brothers, they would work it out of court. But in any event, let's go on so I can give my shir today. Okay. So he says the following. He says, Ulafi daiti od ki ein roy limnos shum mitzvah mishum azharas Yisrael emotion. We should not count any statement that Yisro was encouraging Moshe and the people of Israel to be more careful and to try to achieve a goal. That cannot be counted in the Taryag mitzvahs. Be'elu odia, yeah, I know what the word be'elu mean. I can't translate that word if anyone has a translation. Be'elu lodia osam liYisrael. I'm almost convinced that there's a spelling error here, some sort of typographical error here. Be'elu lodia osam liYisrael. Maybe it should be Ba'elu or something like that. Lodia osam liYisrael lidrosh lehem sheyu zehirim bi'ela mitzvahs tova k'dei l'shakem b'neim ava v'yachva v'shalom v'reus ki b'kach yismatu hataromes. Do you see what the Ramban is saying here? The Ramban is saying explicitly, it's not Berzon. If you want to argue with the Ramban, that's your pleasure. But the Ramban is saying k'dei sheyismatu hataromes. we want to diminish and reduce the amount of taromis. Taromis means when I say to you, why are you drilling in your house? And it sounds like you're drilling in my ear. That's called taromis. I don't know if you ever had that experience. I had it very recently. Yesterday, I had to stop a shear in the middle. I couldn't hear myself. The guy next door was drilling. I thought he was in my house. So what am I going to do? Well, if I have Av and Achva, I feel for the cause. He's trying to add a bathroom to his apartment. And we work it out. Tell me what hours, this and that, and give me a little bit of notice before, etc., etc. But if I'm angry at him, then I might even sue him in a court of law. Probably I'll lose the case, so it's not worth it for me. But that's what he calls taromis. And the Gemara says that on Erev Yom Kippur, we have to go and ask people for mechila when they have a taromis against us, which means that even if they wouldn't win the case necessarily in a court of law, they still have a gripe and a grudge against us because we didn't do it exactly the way the Torah would have wanted us to do it, bi'ava, bi'achva, b'shalom u'v'reis. And this is the key to marriage. A successful marriage is a marriage in which we don't have to go to court in order to resolve our differences. And if we have a taromis one on the other, we try to improve, we try to rectify, we try to work together with ava, shalom v'reis. And I have no doubt that the Ramban borrowed these 4 terms from the bracha of Sheva brachos, which is the blessing that the people come to be mesameach, to give joy to the chas and kala that week after their marriage, and they wish them ava v'achva v'shalom v'reis, kedei l'shakem b'neihem ava, etc. V'adinim b'neihem, so that they don't have to go to court for every single argument that they have. V'lo yitztarchu l'mishpatim b'chol eis, they don't have to be judged at every moment. V'zemi ma'atzaso elav, this was the recommendation of Yisro. And atzaso means it was his personal recommendation. This is what Yisro came up with. V'gam kol ha'am hazel makomo yava b'shalom. The agenda and the hope of Yisro is at the end, the entire nation would come to a state of peace. The Chazal, I don't want to get into this because there's somebody up there that would be very angry at me. His name was Rabbeinu Yitzchak Mibarditcha, Levi Yitzchak Mibarditcha. But the truth is that the people of Israel at that time were full of divisions. I mean, Chazal described the kitos, how they were divided up. We think that the modern state of Israel invented, miflagot and parties, and every 2 people get together and want to form their own party. But this goes back to the time of Klal Yisrael at Yetzias Mitzrayim. And they had basic divisions of opinion. And they were jealous one of the other. According to Chazal, the Gemara in Nazir, there was a fight at Yam Suf as to who was going to jump in first. And it almost came to blows until Nachshon ben Aminadav jumped in. This is typical, unfortunately, of Jewish history. We're an Am Kshei Oreg. And he says, V'odata lehem zu beis chayeihem. Now we have a real problem. Why? Because the BaHaG is going to count the mitzvah of kvura, of burial, as one of the Taryag mitzvahs, and he's going to derive it from Yisro. In other words, when Yisro says Haderech shel yelchu ba, and one of them is kvura, we bury the dead not because of Yisro, we bury the dead because the Torah commands us to bury the dead. And the Torah commands us, Kovar Yikvarenu. These are words in the Torah itself. And he says, Perush Yilbedu Umnus Yichyu Mimeno, we should derive this way of life from the Ribbon Shalom. He buried, Moshe Rabbeinu will bury the dead. Kiboka Kam Kasha Yismatu Hagzelos Vadinim Ve'in Mishi Yovel B'ches V'mitzvahs. What did the BaHaG mean when he included Bichlal Tishbosu Kfuras Mason? Why did he include the burial of the dead in the Taryag? because of Yisro. Ki kfuras mesim bevada yesh lo mitzvahs aseh. Tichsiv ki cover tikvarenu bayom hahu, which, by the way, is both an essay and a losa. So we're not allowed to leave after a person is condemned to death. We're not allowed to hang his body up on a tree and leave it overnight. We have to bury the dead. Zu mitzvahs aseh doshu b'sifri umana hara. In other words, the Rambam himself in number 2 Kufresh, Reish Lamed Aleph 231, the Rambam counts Kvura as a mitzvah aseh. So why is it then that the BaHaG is counting Kvura under the mitzvah of Yisro when the Torah itself explicitly commands us to bury the dead, and the Rambam himself classifies the burial of the dead as one of the Taryag mitzvahs? V'lo od, ela kol amalin esmei, so if you leave the dead overnight, over below saseh. I mean, you have to understand when it's allowed. You know, there's certain situations in which we permit leaving the dead overnight and burying the dead the next day. But again, there has to be a real serious posek and a psak of a rav to allow that. The Torah says, don't leave the dead overnight. And just like we have a losaseh that applies to every dead body, that you're not allowed to leave it without kvura, so too there's an essay that requires burial for every single dead body, not just someone who's condemned to death and put to death by the courts. Ubal halachos shlomona ha'essay hazeh b'nitle. The Baal halachos does not count the mitzvah of kvura in the case of someone who's condemned to death, is therefore chayav hulim noso b'mesim stam. The Baal halachos gedolos doesn't have the option of saying, well, you know what, the mitzvah of kvura only applies to someone who was put to death by the courts. Because the BaHaG himself does not count the mitzvah of kvura as specifically referring to the case of someone who's condemned to death. So b'meila, the BaHaG is going to have to interpret kavod yikvarenu as a general mitzvah that applies to every single dead body. The Tomar Shema Hikpid Arav al Baal Halachos Mipnei she'omar kvuras mesim v'lo omar kvuras meso. The Ramban now comes up with a new twist on the objection of the Rambam. Why did the Rambam object to the BaHaG for counting burial of the dead as a mitzvah? He says, I have a new idea, a new perspective. The BaHaG says, kvuras mesim, as opposed to kvuras meso. So let's understand in Hebrew grammar, we have meso, which is what's called possessive, and it refers to only this specific group of people who possess the dead. That's called burying his dead, meso, as opposed to a generic term, which is kvuras mesim, that includes all the dead body, all the dead people. And the BaHaG went out of his way to count the mitzvah of kvuras mesim, referring to all the dead, and that's what irked the Rambam. The Rambam criticized the BaHaG because he should have said meso, because according to the Ramban, in understanding the Rambam, he says the mitzvah is to bury your dead, which means the following, that the relatives of the deceased are specifically obligated in the mitzvah of burying their relatives. So let's say Shimon dies, Reuven, his brother, is going to bury Shimon. But if Yehuda, the brother of Levi, dies, then Reuven doesn't have an obligation to bury Levi because that obligation is incumbent upon Yehuda. Reuven's not related to the dead, to the deceased. Levi is related to Yehuda. So Reuven is obligated to bury Shimon, but he's not obligated to bury Levi because that obligation falls on the shoulders of Yehuda, the brother of Levi. So therefore, the Rambam didn't understand why did the BaHaG speak and formulate a mitzvah of Kvuras Meisim, implying that every person has to bury every dead. That's not true. When the mitzvah is incumbent specifically and exclusively on the relatives. She'ein mischayev ba ela krovim. Gamzu ein a Torah. He says, no. That could not be the argument of the Rambam. Shebimkom krovim farei aleim utos. Aval im ein shom krovim yemes mitzvah shemitzvah seishlo docha pesach u'mila v'kohen gadol v'nosir v'chmir bo yosem mishar mitzvah. It's not true to say that the mitzvah of burying the dead is limited and restricted to the relatives. That's not so. I'll prove to you that the mitzvah of Kvuras Meisim applies to anyone to bury any mess, even if it's not his relative. And the Ramban introduces the concept here of mes mitzvah, which means that if somebody dies and there are no immediate relatives to bury him, then the first person who could bury him is obligated to bury him, even though he's not a relative. And even if that person who encounters the dead body is a Kohen Gadol, who's not even allowed to bury his close relatives, or he's a Nazir who's not allowed to be Matami himself to Mesa. And even if he's both a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir, and even if he's on his way to bring the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, and if he doesn't bring it, he violates an Isur Kares. And if he's going to bury the dead, he won't be able to bring this Korban Pesach because he's Tameh. Or if he's on his way to Milah, to circumcise a child, and that mitzvah, like Korban Pesach, engenders a Chiyuv Kares, and he's going to delay the Milah because he buried the dead, nevertheless, he's obligated to bury the dead. The mitzvah of burying the dead, which is called Kvuras Mes Mitzvah, supersedes all other mitzvahs. It's greater than the mitzvah of Kohen Gadol. It's greater than the mitzvah of Nazir. It's greater than the mitzvah of Milah. It's greater than and trumps the mitzvah of Pesach. It basically is in a category of its own. So don't argue against the BaHaG because he formulated the mitzvah of Kvuras Meisim, implying even though it's not your relative, because that's in fact the case. And the mitzvah of Kvura, in a case of a mes mitzvah, is a mitzvah that applies to everyone to bury the dead. It's not limited to the relatives. And now the Ramban shifts his focus to another mitzvah, which the BaHaG includes in the Taryag. And that is called Chishuv Tkufos Umazolos. What is that all about? Which has to do with making astronomical calculations. That's about the mitzvah of Ibur Shonim. So that every couple of years, in order to, what word do I want to use? Not reconcile, but in order to realign the lunar and the solar calendars, we need sometimes, it's approximately every 3 years or so, to add another month. And that's called Ibur Shonim. Ibur Milashon, pregnancy. We have to make the year pregnant by, instead of 12 months, it's got a 13th month. And that will align the calendar in such a way that the month of Nisan will come out in what's called the Aviv, in the spring, so that Pesach, which the Torah describes as Chag HaAviv, will always fall in the spring. And if you don't realign the calendar, then what's going to happen is the lunar calendar is going to lag behind the solar calendar to such an extent that who knows when Pesach is going to be observed. But in order to realign this and equalize it, so we add another month. And the BaHaG counts that as one of the mitzvahs. And where does he derive it from the Torah? Where in the Torah do we have this mitzvah of Ibur Shanim? The Chsiv, at the end of Parshas Re'eh, it says, Shamar es chodesh aviv. Make sure that Pesach, guarantee that Pesach falls in the Aviv, not in the winter, but in the spring. And the Gemara tells us in Rosh Hashanah, on Daf Chaf Aleph, Ki de chazis de mashcha tkuvas teves ad shitzar ben Nisan ibra lahi shata. So the word shata is referring to a month. Ibra is referring to add an extra month. And if you see that kufas teves, which is that has to do with the equinox, but it basically, we're talking about the winter months in Teves, like December, and somehow it's stretched into Nisan. So it means that the Tkufas Teves, which again, that depends on the solar calendar, is now entering into Nisan, so that Nisan is in the winter. Then Ibra Lahishata, add an extra month, V'lo techush lo, and then you don't have any problems with the solar calendar. V'chsiv shmar es chodesh ha'aviv. Shmar aviv shel tkufa sheyev chodesh Nisan. So guarantee that the aviv will coincide with the month of Nisan, and that's called shmar es chodesh ha'aviv. V'shana b'sifri shmar es hachodesh shehu samach li aviv. So we derive in the Sifri from this pasuk of Shomer Chodesh HaAviv the mitzvah, the obligation of being ma'aber the Shana. And by the way, just as a footnote on the side, you see from the BaHaG, by counting this as a mitzvah, that a mitzvah could qualify as one of the 613, even though you're not obligated, I'm not obligated, but rather the courts representing Klal Yisrael are obligated. And Ibur Shana is not something that you and I will have to implement, but rather the Beis Din will have to make this evaluation and decision as to whether or not to add an extra month. But that makes it into a mitzvah. Im hoisa chasera arba sar yom o chamisha sar yom. If, let's say, you're missing 14 days, 15 days to catch up to the solar calendar, is Talmud Lomer Chodesh. What does Chodesh mean? It says Shmar es HaChodesh, es Chodesh Aviv. It means that we add a month. Chodesh means a month. Lo pachos v'lo yosef. We don't add less than a month. So we're not going to adjust the calendar for a shorter period of time. We're not going to adjust the calendar in such a way that, you know what, let's catch up by adding 2 extra months. No. It's got to be 1 month. Lo pachos v'lo yosef. V'zu mitzvah sei. And this is certainly a mitzvah say, and I'll prove it to you from a Gemara Menachos Lamed Vav of Beis. He shomer the essay. The Gemara uses this example of shomer es chodesh ha'aviv to prove and illustrate that when the Torah uses the word shomer or hishomer, it's a mitzvah say. The Hinei Rav Atzma, the Rambam himself, Mona Mitzvah Kuf Nun Gimel Lekadesh Chadashim, that we are obligated as one of the 613 to sanctify the month and determine when is Rosh Chodesh. V'lechashev Shonim v'Chadashim v'Beis Din bilvad, and the calculation of the years and the months is implemented by the courts and only by the courts. Shenevar HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chadash. The word Lachem in the plural is a mandate that addresses Bezdin, representing the entity of Lachem, meaning the entire community of Israel. Rishon hu lachem l'chodshei hashana, and Nisan should be the first month of the year. Now it's interesting that there's going to be a machlokas between the Rambam and the BaHaG about how many mitzvahs we're going to count here with regard to these calculations and the decision-making process, at the end of which we add a month. Harav yachshov kol tikudei ha'ibur mitzvasei achas. The Rambam will collapse all of this into one mitzvah. Aval bal halachos yasosom shtayim. The BaHaG will count them as two different mitzvahs. Why? Mana, Kvius Roshe Hadashim, the Chishuv Tkufos, Tahainu Klomar Ibrashon. So calculating the month and establishing the first day of the new month and calculating the years in such a way that we add a month to the year, which is called Ibrashon. Each one deserves to be counted as a separate mitzvah, according to the BaHaG, whereas according to the Rambam, it's all one mitzvah. So according to the Rambam, there's a general mitzvah called Zmanim, which means that Bezdin is in charge of determining the Zman. They will establish what day of the month it is based on Rosh Chodesh, because they sanctify Rosh Chodesh, and they will calculate the Zman of the year as to whether the year will have 12 months or 13 months. All that comes under one single rubric, one mitzvah, in the Taryag. That's the Rambam Shita. But according to the BaHaG, no. There are two separate mitzvahs. There's one mitzvah called HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, and Bezdin are commanded to establish the first day of the new month. And there's another mitzvah called Shomer Chodesh HaAviv, which means that Bezdin in charge of the entire year to guarantee that if need be, we will be Ma'aber the Shem. And then Shomeres HaChodesh HaAviv, O Shmartmas HaChuka Zos L'Moadim Yom Yomima, Shemor Al Ibur Shonim Mitzvah Se'acheres. Okay. We're coming very close to the end of this presentation of the Ramban. And I don't think we could finish it all today. I'll just read very quickly the next paragraph in the Ramban, but we're going to have to take this up as a separate topic in order to be mashlim to complete our study of this Ramban. So asu mitzvos shenitnu lem min hashamayim. Ve'iluhein mitzvos shenitnu lem min hashamayim ibur shanim ukvias chadash. So the Sifri is indicating that there are two mitzvahs here that are indicated by the pasuk Haziru Hashamayim, and these are two mitzvahs that are given min hashamayim, and they are, again in plural, mitzvos. Number one, Ibur Shanim, and number two, Kvias Chadash. Shenemar, because the pasuk says V'hayu li osos u'lemoadim u'liyomim u'lishanim v'tishma oretz. So asu mitzvos shenitnu lehem min haaretz. Iluhein mitzvos shenitnu lehem ba'aretz leket v'eluhein mitzvah shenitnu lehem ba'aretz leket shikha peah truma masas shmita v'yochos. So it seems clear from this Sifri that we count the mitzvah of Ibur Hashana and the mitzvah of keep Kviyas HaChadoshim as two separate mitzvahs. Okay, then, so that's what we want to stop here. I'll just make myself a note. All right, I could do that later. Oh, here it is.
Thank you, Rabbi Berzon.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a Chag Sameach. And make sure that on Shavuos you're makabel no less than 6:13.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.